Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the initial NBA show. I'm your host, CJ, and this week we got a great episode. We are going team by team, division by division, conference by conference in the NBA. Who's going to be good this year? Who's going to suck? And who's going to be somewhere in the middle? Yeah, full breakdowns of every team. And we even, as of right now, Damian Lillard and James Harden are still with their existing teams. But we'll break down where these teams would sit given a move that would happen either for Portland or the 76ers. So yeah, let's get rolling. All right, so we're about a month out from the start of the NBA season. So I figured now's probably the time to talk about NBA tier lists. At least when it comes to where teams stack up and kind of where I see them going this year. So yeah, we're just gonna break down every team, East and West, to figure out who are the contenders, who's maybe not a contender but pretty safely in the playoffs, which teams are going to be fighting for kind of more of that play-in tournament, and then what teams are essentially playing for 2024 and beyond, because there's plenty of those teams. So we're going to start out with the East, start out with the championship contenders. So with these tier lists, so essentially with these championship contenders, these are pretty much cases where everything is in place for a run to the finals. Maybe they do need to make a fringe move here or there, but their teams as currently constructed, I think, have a really good shot to making it to the finals. So to start out the East, there's two teams in this championship contenders tier for me. It's the Boston Celtics at 1, and then the Milwaukee Bucks at 2. And I also do kind of rank within these tiers where teams are. So start with the Celtics. To me, this is the best team in the East. They added Kristaps Porzingis. They lost Marcus Smart and Grant Williams. I think roster wise, that ends up, I think, just kind of being a wash, assuming that Porzingis is healthy, which last year he was. So, I think Porzingis is maybe, he's been an all-star before, and I think he has that ceiling, whereas Smart, wasn't quite at that level, and Grant Williams definitely wasn't at that level. So essentially, they trade their starting point guard for who I think will probably be their starting, power forward, I guess, or center. One of those two front court spots, probably with Al Horford, which I think is a good trade because you look at that trade off. You look at Boston's roster. You have Derek White, you have Malcolm Brogdon. Both those guys could run the point. You have a projected lineup of either White or Brogdon starting. Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Horford, Porzingis. That's easily one of the best starting fives in the NBA. And yeah, you lose a little bit of depth with Grant Williams, but I think you can always find depth pieces elsewhere. Whether that be a trade at the deadline or one of your kind of more depth pieces, rookies, whatever, ends up kind of turning into a player for you. So I'm not too worried about Boston's depth because there's still potential for a move to be made. So, last year finished second in the East, won 57 games. They made the Eastern Conference Finals, losing to Miami in 7 after blowing a 3-1 series lead, which is rough, but their team's young enough, got the talent. I think they're the best team in the East. Now, Milwaukee, this is who I think is second best in the East. They essentially, their changes this offseason, it's all back-end rotation guys. They lost Wesley Matthews, Joe Ingles, Javon Carter, but they added Malik Beasley. Last year they obviously ended first in the East, winning 58 games, actually most in the NBA last year. But they did lose in the first round of Miami. Obviously that ended up getting their coach fired. Not a great playoff run to lose to an 8 seed as a 1 seed. But to be fair, Giannis was hurt basically 10 minutes into game 1. And he didn't come back until game 4, and he was coming off a back injury. He was definitely still feeling the injury from game 1. So in terms of losses, this wasn't like an absolute collapse necessarily by the Bucks. Remember, the Heat did make the finals. It's more of they had a really bad injury at the worst possible time, and they happened to run across a team that was going to make a historic run to the finals. So I still think Milwaukee, assuming they stay healthy, which that's the thing with them. They're like one of the oldest teams in the league, but assuming they stay healthy, can manage their minutes appropriately, they're definitely going to be in the mix to win the East, and I have them number 2 just behind Boston. So yeah, that's essentially all I have for the East contenders. It's the Celtics, it's the Bucks. Then there's this, I don't want to call them a contender, but I don't think they're necessarily in that next tier. And part of it has to do with the uncertainty around them. The Philadelphia 76ers. So I have them as the third best team in the West or in the East. They lost Georges Niang, they lost Jalen McDaniels, but they added Pat Bev and Mo Bamba. So essentially nothing major yet. And we'll get to the elephant in the room here. Nothing major in terms of moves in the offseason. They finished third in the East last year. They won 54 games. They lost to Boston in 7. Obviously with kind of some all-time horrific performances by their 2 best players, Embiid and Harden, which, they ended up, getting rid of Doc Rivers, who has a kind of a history of playoff failures from Nick Nurse, which personally is a great move, I think. Nick Nurse obviously won that championship in Toronto. He's a good coach to have, and, Doc Rivers, I think he tends to, he just doesn't have the playoff success you would think for a guy that has been coaching the league for 25 years at this point. So the roster is pretty much the same, with the Harden situation notwithstanding. So the reason I put them at 3, and I think they could be in that contender tier. However, it is entirely dependent on what happens with James Harden. So, if he stays and he's bought in, or they trade him and they get equal value back. So Dame Lillard, pretty much the obvious example there. They're in that same group with Milwaukee and Boston. Now, if they end up, the Harden situation doesn't resolve itself, he still wants out, doesn't show up, whatever, and they end up trading him, or, they don't trade him, but he's not playing, either one of those scenarios, there's still going to be a playoff team because they have the reigning MVP. They still have a good roster around Embiid. The problem is they won't have that guy to kind of get them over the top. So that's why, for me, I have Philadelphia in this in-between tier between contender and just solid playoff team, just because there's that question mark of what's going to happen with Harden. So if he stays, 100% they're a contender. I would take them over Milwaukee. Probably not Boston, but definitely over Milwaukee. But if the Harden situation doesn't resolve itself and Philly, doesn't get equal value back, they're still going to be in the playoffs, but I wouldn't expect much out of them, honestly. And like I've said in previous podcasts, when it comes to Philadelphia and James Harden, for both parties, the best solution is for them to play it out this year. Harden's not going to get in a better situation as much as he probably thinks he will be in. Philadelphia is right now the best situation for him in terms of winning. In Philadelphia, they're going to be hard-pressed to be able to find a replacement for Harden. So if everyone was kind of going off of what's best for them, they would get along this year, play out the contract, and then part ways after this season. So now we're at the actual tier, solid playoff team. So this tier is, they have talent, they're going to be in the playoffs, but in order for a finals run, they would need things to break a very specific way for that to happen, in my opinion. So the first team I have in this tier, the first real team I have in this tier is the Cleveland Cavaliers. So in terms of, changes this offseason, obviously last year they finished 4th in the East, lost to New York in the first round, and then they ended up adding Georges Niang, Max Strus, and then lost Jetty Osman, Danny Green, Javon Carter. So actually pretty good, in my opinion, pretty good upgrades for their roster. They essentially got who I think will probably be their starting small forward in Strus. Got a rotation piece, and the people that they lost this offseason. Jetty was the big one, where he was, according to playoff minutes per game this last year, he was their sixth man essentially. So I think pretty good roster upgrade. With them, the big thing is how does Evan Mobley, what happens with him in his third year, right? They have a really good roster. You look at Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, Jared Allen, Karis LeVert off the bench. Like they have some really good pieces. Evan Mobley is that X factor because he has just the physical tools and the talent to be one of the best kind of big men in the NBA. And already he's one of the best defensive big men in the NBA. So if his offensive game can kind of take a little bit of a leap, and he kind of, starts to fulfill what I think people thought he was going to do last year, given just the amount of talent he uses, I think they could realistically win the East. Cleveland can, assuming Evan Mobley takes a big step in his development, which he's definitely capable of, but we'll see if it actually happens. So I have Cleveland number 4 in the East as a solid playoff teams. They'll be in the mix, be challenging for one of those top seeds, and honestly, they can easily get one of those with injury here, someone playing out of their mind there. How it ends up going. So that's Cleveland at number 4. Number 5, I have the reigning East champs, the Miami Heat. So, obviously last year lost to Denver in the finals in 5 games. They ended up finishing 7th in the East last year, and then I think they lost the playing game that made them the 8th seed. They definitely took a step back roster-wise. They lost Strus and Vincent, so essentially their starting backcourt gone. They lost Victor Oladipo, who before he got hurt was an important rotation guy for him. And then the guys they added Thomas Bryant, who essentially sat on the bench all of Denver's championship run. And obviously their rookie, Jaime Jaquez Jr., who, given the depth of Miami right now, probably will be part of the rotation, I would assume, because they definitely lost some talent this offseason. Now, here's the thing. There's been the Damian Lillard talks, and Miami's been like that number 1 team there. If they do end up getting Lillard somehow, which personally I do not think is going to happen just because they don't really have the assets to trade. However, if they do end up getting Lillard and they still have Adebayo and Jimmy Butler, they are immediately move up to that contender tier. And honestly, I would again have them number 2 right behind Boston. This is even if the rest of their roster ended up being bare bones after the trade as a result. So Miami, there's still some moving pieces in this potentially, but as of right now, as of how their roster is today, I have them at number 5. And a lot of that is just because I know that with Jimmy Butler, with Eric Spoelstra, just with those 2 guys, they're going to be competitive, right? You have the best coach in the NBA. I don't think that's crazy to say. And you have one of the best, turn it on when it matters most guys in the NBA. I think they're always going to be in the mix, as annoying as it is. And even past Butler, they still have Adebayo and Hero, which are both really good players, especially Adebayo. That dude's, I love watching that guy play. He's great. So yeah, right now Miami number 5. Number 6, I have the New York Knicks. They also are in this playoff tier. Last year finished 5th in the East, won 47 games. They lost to Miami in 6 in the second round. In terms of their roster changes, they lost Derrick Rose and Obi Toppin. Not really huge losses at this point. And they added Dante DiVincenzo, who will definitely be in the rotation. I think that was a good pickup by the Knicks. So they upgraded their roster a bit. The Knicks are going to be good. I'm sure everyone in New York would be happy to hear that. The Knicks are going to be good. However, I feel like they're kind of like one top end players short to really be a contender. Jalen Brunson's awesome. Julius Randle's pretty good. I know, I like Dante DiVincenzo's pickup quickly. I like him. Quentin Grimes, I think, is a decent player. Mitchell Robinson's like, they have some good pieces. I just don't feel like they have that top end, top tier, top 10 type of guy that you pretty much need to be in this contender mix, right? When you think of the contenders in the East that I've listed off, you have Boston, who has Jason Tatum. You have Milwaukee with Giannis. You have potentially Philadelphia with Embiid. Those essentially are, easily 3 of the top 10 players in the NBA. Probably 3 of the top 5, if we're being honest. Even Miami, if they jump into that contender tier, you're talking a team with Damian Lillard, who, as of right now, I don't think it's a stretch to say he's top 15 in the NBA. So as good as I think New York's going to be, I think they're going to be a pretty good team. You need to have one of those top 15 guys, I think, to really be a contender. There are very few cases we've seen where a team hasn't had one of those top 15 guys in the game and still been able to go on a run and win a championship. Really the only team I can think of is the 2004 Detroit Pistons. Outside of that, every championship team is going to have a LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, Steph Curry, Jokic, Giannis, name a superstar. One of those guys is needed for a championship. So the New York Knicks need one of those guys, I think, to take that leap. With everything happening in Philly, you never know. I know there's been some rumblings of that, hey, if things don't work out in Philly, maybe Embiid ends up in New York somehow. It'll be interesting to see what happens, because the Philadelphia situation, and then, to a lesser extent, the Lillard situation changes how the season's going to play out drastically. So it'll be interesting to see. So essentially those are my playoff team, solid playoff team tier, essentially tier 2. We have Philly, that's kind of straddling the line, Cleveland, Miami, and the Knicks. All right, now for tier 3. So these are going to be your play-in teams. So these are going to be the 4 teams that are play-in bound. For the most part, they're not going to be serious threats for the finals. They're more or less happy to be there. So at number 7, and this is where I think my list starts to stray away from what I think chalk is in terms of kind of the national narrative and media and whatever. At 7, I have the Indiana Pacers. So they lost a couple pieces, Chris Duarte, O'Shea Brissett, a couple bench pieces. But they added a guy I love as a Nuggets fan, Bruce Brown, Brucey B. Very sad he had to leave, but Indiana gave him a pretty big pay raise, so I don't blame him. So they added Bruce Brown, who I think probably will slot in as a starter, and then Obi Toppin. He'll probably be part of the rotation. So last year, they finished 11th in the East, won 37 games. They missed the playoffs. With Indiana, though, they have a young team, and they're going to be in that play-in mix. So that they definitely improve the roster with Bruce Brown. They will continue to see improvement from Halliburton, from Benedict Mathurin. Buddy Hield is still there. He's one of the best shooters in the NBA. Miles Turner is still a good player. They have a pretty solid roster, with kind of Halliburton being that, I think, main guy for them. So I expect the Pacers to be a good team who I think will make the plan. However, I don't think they'll really do much past that. But again, pretty young team, so I wouldn't expect too much out of them yet. At number 8, I have kind of one of the biggest. This team is one that everyone loves. Their young pieces, the Orlando Magic. I have at 8 in making the plan. In the offseason they added Joe Ingles. His depth, I don't know how much he'll actually play. He was coming off a pretty bad ACL injury, I think it was. And they lost Bol, who, is tantalizing as a talent, but is never really put it together in Denver or in Orlando. Last year they finished 13th in the East. They won 34 games. They missed the playoffs. Roster is pretty much the same. Those two guys I mentioned for the changes, Bol and Joe Ingles, don't really move the needle much. But they did draft Anthony Black, who I think is going to be a really good player. He has that kind of like large point guard size that kind of everyone wants. Hopefully he can put it together. But, Orlando's very similar to Indiana, but I think it even, has more young talent. They're a super young, talented team that are probably a couple years away from, any kind of contention. But, given just the talent they have in Paolo, Franz, Fultz, Black, like they have some dudes that long term I think are going to be really good. So I might be a year ahead on the Magic being in the play-in. That's fine. But if you're a Magic fan, you have to be pretty excited about who they have as a super young team. So yeah, number 8, Orlando Magic. Like what they're doing there. Number 9, and this is a team that I honestly, when I was doing this list initially, I had them out of the playoffs entirely. But I kind of changed course once I kind of looked at their roster again. I have the Atlanta Hawks at number 9. So they lost John Collins, who it seems like they've been trying to trade for about 30 years. And then they added Patty Mills and Wes Matthews, so you're talking just some rotation pieces. Not necessarily like a big free agent or trade get or anything like that. But, they lost in the first round last year in 6 to Boston. And while Collins was kind of perpetual trade piece, the roster still downgraded in losing him. But, Trae Young and DeJounte Murray, I like that backcourt. I don't really like Trae Young that much, but I really like DeJounte Murray, so that kind of like cancels it out. So I still think they're a good backcourt. They have some good pieces in DeAndre Hunter and Bogdanovich. But I will say long term, I'm not sure how effective a team built up around Trae Young can actually be. Just because his defensive deficiencies are really bad. And he's small, so he really doesn't even have the size to, I don't think, really make it better. With that said, he's a crazy good offensive player. And in today's NBA, that can get you decently far. And they do have DeJounte Murray, who's a really good defensive player in it, himself. So he does cover a little bit of the deficiencies Trae Young has on the defensive end. But I do, at first I had Atlanta missing the playoffs, but after kind of thinking about their backcourt, some of their other, good players in Hunter and Bogdanovich, I was like, you know what? They probably are a play-in team, as much as I don't really want to admit it. But yeah, so number 9, Atlanta. Number 10, I have the Chicago Bulls. And the reason is they still have some good players, and they don't seem like they're wanting to start over. So yeah, let's just, they finished 10th last year in the East. They lost in the play-in. As far as roster turnover, they lost Pat Bev and Derrick Jones Jr. They added Torrey Craig and Javon Carter. So I think a slight upgrade roster-wise. Really nothing too crazy. But I mean, they still have DeRozan, still have Levine. They're both really good players. They're not quite what they were. At least, I don't think they're quite as good as they were, 3 or 4 years ago. But they're still really good players in the NBA. Nikola Vucevic is still a serviceable center, at least offensively. Defensively, I don't think he's super great. But the issue is, and why I have them at 10 is they seem to still want to try to compete. Given they gave Vucevic an extension this summer, they are keeping Levine and DeRozan, even though I know there's a team out there that would probably want either one of those guys as kind of that third piece on a contending team. But the thing is, their roster is maxed out. I don't like. There's nowhere on this team really that you're like, oh, that guy can put them over the top. Like, for me, their roster, it's as good as it's going to get, given who they have. There's not going to be much improvements in terms of young guys getting better outside of maybe Patrick Williams. I think is the only real young piece they have on this roster. So for me, personally, it would make more logical sense for the Bulls to blow it up and start over. But it doesn't seem like they're going to do that. So I have them at number 10 pretty much because, hey, I still like DeRozan. I still like Levine a bit. So they're still going to win some games just because they do have at least some star talent. It's not superstar talent, but both those guys have made a couple all-star games each. So that counts for something, right? So yeah, those are the playoff team or the play-in teams I have: the Pacers, Magic, Hawks, Bulls. Now let's go to the teams playing for 2024 and beyond. So those are teams for the most part, and we'll get to the West where it's a little crazier. But these are teams where I think the finals are a pipe dream. There's no way they're going to make the finals. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say with some of these teams, but let's just go over them pretty quick. So at 11 in the East, I have the Brooklyn Nets. Essentially, they lost Seth Curry, Joe Harris, and Yuta Watanabe, but they added Lonnie Walker, Dennis Smith Jr. Last year, they finished 6th in the East, winning 45 games, but that's kind of a lie. A lot of that is prior to the KD trade. So, if they're playing the entire year with their roster, they're more like 9th or 10th in the East rather than 6th, in all honesty. They got swept by the 76ers in the first round. The roster downgraded for sure. Losing Seth Curry, Joe Harris, two of the better three-point shooters in the league. With that said, they got some good pieces to build around. They have Bridges is awesome. Cam Johnson just got an extension. He's pretty good. Cam Thomas, would light it up every once a week or so, score 40 or whatever it was last year. So, there's an outside chance they end up in the play-in, especially because I think the East is definitely the weaker conference. That definitely benefits Brooklyn. I just don't like them quite as much as the play-in team, so that's why I got them at 11. Number 12, I have the Toronto Raptors. Last year, finished 9th in the East, lost in the play-in. They added Dennis Schroeder, lost Fred VanVleet, so that's probably a bit of a downgrade. New coach. They moved on from Nick Nurse, who's now in Philadelphia, and switched to Darko Rajokovic. I think I said that right. I assume I did. So the roster did downgrade. Pascal Siakam's great. He's awesome. I think he wasn't he an All-NBA player last year? I know he has made an All-NBA team. I think last year was one of them. But there's some questions with some of their young guys. Scotty Barnes, for example, I don't think he really made the leap a bunch of people were expecting last year. OG Anunoby's good, but it seems like it seems like over the last couple of years, Toronto's always in trade discussions. Like, they're always trying to trade, Anunoby, Siakam, whoever, for whatever reason. So I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of decide to blow it up and start over, especially with Van Vliet leaving in free agency. So that's why I have them at 12. Is I think this might finally be the time where they decide to pull, hey, let's just hard reset, start over, and we'll come back stronger in 2026. Because Siakam's good, really good, but if he's the guy you're building around, you're probably not going to be in a contender tier. So to me, it would make sense for Toronto to trade Siakam, and then just kind of start over, building around, Scotty Barnes, guys like that, just to, hit the reset button. They've been competitive for a while, so you got to give them some credit. But I think we're finally starting to see this Toronto team, kind of go full rebuild mode. At least I think they should. So that's Toronto at 12. 13, we have the Charlotte Hornets. ugh, they're going to be bad. They lost Kelly Oubre Jr. and Dennis Smith Jr. Losing Kelly Oubre Jr. Is probably an addition by subtraction. He's not definitely he's a tough 3-point shooter. That's a tough one. But they added Frank Ntilikina, and obviously they drafted Brandon Miller. Last year they won 27 games, finished 14th in the East. Obviously missed the playoffs. But yeah, this team is going to be tough to watch. This is going to be one of those that the only time you watch them is if your team is playing them, and even then that might be one of the few games you miss because you're probably going to win this one. With that said, I mean, LaMelo was an all-star last year. Brandon Miller, number 2 overall pick. A lot of people liked him coming out of college. So, it's not like everything's barren in Charlotte, but it's at this point, it's pretty much another year, another, Charlotte Hornet finishing bottom 3 in the East. So, yeah, the Charlotte Hornets, number 13. Number 14, I have the Detroit Pistons. They lost Corey Joseph, but they added Joe Harris, Monte Morris, and then one of the Thompson twins. That roster got better. Joe Harris is a good 3-point shooter. I love me Monte Morris. I am a Denver homer, so that's probably part of my bias towards him. But I love Monte Morris as a backup point guard. He doesn't turn the ball over, which when you're a backup point guard, that should be your number one responsibility, is not turning the ball over. So I'm a big Monte Morris fan. You can ask my wife. Their team is young, and they have some good pieces, right? They have Cade Cunningham coming back, which essentially is like adding a new player. So the team's going to be bad, but they're going to be better than last year for sure. Like last year, they only won 17 games. They were 15. They were last in the East. They're not going to win 40, but they'll win 25 to 30, and not be dead last in the East. So, Cade Cunningham, at least they have a good guy to build around. Thompson twin, another good guy to build around. They're in this rebuild, hitting full rebuild mode. If you're a Pistons fan, I'm sorry, it's gonna be tough for the next couple of years, but you have some exciting talent, so look to the future, I guess. So that's the Pistons at 14, and then at 15, dead last in the East, I have the Washington Wizards. So obviously they lost Bradley Beal, they lost Kristaps Porzingis, they lost Monte Morris. Again, big fan of Monte Morris. And then they replaced those guys with one Jordan Poole, Landry Shamet, and a aging Danilo Gallinari. This is going to be the worst team in the NBA, I think. They won 35 games last year, and that was with Bradley Beal and a healthy Porzingis all year. So now they're essentially replacing that for Jordan Poole, who, I think is talented, but he's a chucker, man. And I actually kind of like that the Wizards are just finally going full reset mode. They've kind of been in this mediocrity for years where, especially after John Wall kind of played him, was done in Washington, they've been in this mode where, hey, we have Bradley Beal, and then it's like, okay, cool. That's good for maybe 30 wins a year, I guess. So I'm glad, even though the Wizards will be the worst team in the league this year, I think, it is smart for them to go full reset. And I'm glad they finally did it. I'm glad those pained Wizards fans can finally say it's over. We can suck for a couple years, and hopefully on the other side, we have some young studs to bring us back into contention, the Gilbert Arenas days or whatever it is. So yeah, number 15, that is the Wizards. So yeah, that's it for the East. So just quick recap. We have the contenders being the Celtics and the Bucks. Then you have I don't know where to put them, but they could be contender depending on the Harden situation, 76ers. That's its own tier. And then you have the playoff teams, solid playoff teams, the Cavs, the Heat, the Knicks. And then you got the play-in teams, Pacers, Magic, Hawks, Bulls. And then you have the teams playing for 2024 and beyond. You have the Nets, Raptors, Hornets, Pistons, and Wizards. All right, that is the East. Now, let's talk about the West. So, When it comes to the contenders in the West, there are three. If you want to call me a homer, this is fine. Because at number one, I have the Denver Nuggets. And this year, I can justify that because they are the defending champions. So, just throwing that out there. Um, so, yeah, obviously finished first in the West last year, won 57 games. Won the championship with, Jokic just destroying everybody in his path because he's incredible. And now he's partying in Serbia like he so deserves. As far as roster changes, so they lost Bruce Brown, which is a tough one. He was their sixth man. He closed a lot of games for them. He's essentially their backup point guard, backup shooting guard, and backup small forward at times. Super versatile guy. So that really sucked to lose him. But again, do not blame him for taking essentially like 4 times the money that Denver could have offered him from Indiana. So honestly, hope he does well in Indiana and maybe he comes back in the next couple of years. They also lost Jeff Green. He was essentially their number 7 in the rotation. Again, this is based on playoff minutes per game is kind of how I determined who was sixth man, who was in rotation, things like that. Jeff Green is, he was the veteran. It definitely hurts losing one of those veterans, but there were definitely times where I'm like, dude, get Jeff Green out of the game. He was solid, but for like very short stints. But it was always entertaining to watch him essentially turn the clock back 20 years and dunk on a guy. And you're like, oh my God, this guy's 36 and he's doing this. This is crazy. So those are the big losses for the Nuggets. They added Justin Holiday, who's really the only non-rookie they added. He'll probably be part of the rotation. But honestly, the Nuggets are kind of looking more for their rotation to fill from within. So the roster has a little less depth. They lost Brucey B. That sucks. That hurts. But they're assuming Christian Brown continues to improve, which if you watched the finals last year, he was a spark plug. I think it was in game 2 or 3 that they needed. He played really good down the stretch, especially for a rookie. And the Nuggets are essentially betting on Peyton Watson, his development. He really only played, I think it was like maybe a half a dozen games last year during the regular season, but he kind of popped as like a, help side, weak side help defender, blocking shots. He can hit the 3 a little bit. So the Nuggets are definitely betting on him becoming a good rotation player. And I think has the tools to be an awesome defensive guy. So I know the Nuggets as an organization are excited about him. I think that's part of the reason why during free agency they really didn't do a whole lot. They re-signed Reggie Jackson, which I get why they did it. They probably weren't going to find anything better out on the market, but I'm not super excited about that necessarily. I think come playoff time, it's going to end up being, the starting 5, which thank God stayed intact. So we're good there. You'll have Christian Brown, as kind of that first guy off the bench. You'll have Peyton Watson. And then, as far as kind of that next guy in the rotation, I'm not really sure what they end up doing. They drafted a couple guys like Pickett, who, was older in the draft and, potentially could play as a rookie. I think they like kind of how he fits in what the Nuggets do. Strother is kind of your, prototypical 3-point shooter guy. And then Hunter Tyson in the summer league was awesome. So I guess we'll see what happens there. Then they have guys like, Zeke Naji as kind of that, backup 5, I guess. And the Nuggets probably utilize more of the Aaron Gordon minutes at the 5, similar to what they did in the playoffs. So I'm not too worried about the Nuggets. They still have the best player in the world. They still have the best playoff riser pretty much ever in Jamal Murray. And they still have, the rest of their starting 5, which I think complements each other perfectly. So I think, this is the year we'll finally see an all-star Jamal Murray. Finally. I think it's 2 years in the making, basically, before he tore his ACL. But the Nuggets are going to be, I think, the best team in the NBA. And until they end up losing in the playoffs, it's going to be hard to argue that, I guess. So, number 1, Denver Nuggets. If you listen to this and know I'm a Nuggets fan, I don't know if anyone's really surprised. Number 2, I have the Phoenix Suns. So obviously they finished fourth in the West last year, lost in the second round of the Nuggets. As far as roster changes, what didn't they change? Pretty much, they have Ayton, they have Katie, they have Booker. Pretty much everything else is different. They lost Torrey Craig, Jock Landale, Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, Cam Payne, but they added Bradley Beal, Eric Gordon, Yuta, Bol, a couple other guys. Essentially, they changed their entire team up. Beal, Booker, Durant, best trio in the NBA. I don't know if you can really argue that, personally. I mean, people will try, but, I mean, Booker and Durant are two of the top 10 players in the NBA, yeah? So, I think if you have two of the top 10 guys in the NBA, I think you automatically are a top trio, right? And that third guy in that trio is Bradley Beal, who, all-star himself. So, they're going to win a lot of games. Like I said, best trio in the NBA. The questions kind of come when it comes to depth, which, to be honest, they did a really good job of addressing that. Like, even before the Beal deal happened and all that stuff, there was questions of, if you have three max guys, like, what in the hell do you even put around them? Because you're out of money. But they ended up doing a really good job. Like, Eric Gordon in particular, that was a great pickup. So I think that, that was a good one. Yuta was a good pickup. Bol maybe will play some. He has the talent at least. I mean, the Suns are going to be good. But their question is, the depth, which I think they kind of did a good job about addressing. And then the other one is point guard. Beal and Booker, neither of those guys are really true point guards. Like, I know Booker played it in his first couple years in the league, but that's not really his true position. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I was actually kind of surprised they got rid of Cam Payne after, they kind of got rid of him later after making the trade and making all the other moves. There still are questions, but they're still going to be one of the best teams in the league. And they're going to be contenders just because of that top three alone. There's probably other moves to be made, right? Find a buyout guy here, trade for a small contract there. They're going to be able to probably maybe fill out their roster a little bit more, but they're going to be contenders regardless, just because of Booker and Durant. Then you throw Beal on top, that's like icing on the cake. And the fact they got to keep DeAndre Ayton, actually surprised he's still with the Suns, to be honest. So, number 2, Phoenix Suns. As much as I hate to admit it, I think they're the second best team in the NBA. Number 3, another one I hate to admit as a Nuggets fan, the Los Angeles Lakers. So, obviously last year they lost to the Nuggets in 4 in the Western Conference Finals. They finished 7th in the West last year. Though that's kind of a lie. I think they were the second best team record-wise in the NBA after the trade deadline. So while they were 7th in the West, that was because of a poor early season, and come playoff time, they were definitely not the 7th best team in the West. So for me, this kind of comes down to, it's really tough to bet against any LeBron team, in my opinion. He's a top 3 player all time. I don't think that's really can be argued. If you do, then I question what you know about basketball personally. So I'm going to bet for a LeBron team always. They're able to kind of retain guys that, they're good pieces that I did not think would be able to stay. Hachimura and Reeves. I 100% thought Reeves would be gone. I thought he would sign a big offer sheet with someone like San Antonio. And either the Lakers would pay big and not be able to keep Hachimura and, D'Angelo Russell, who we'll talk about. But, turns out the Lakers kind of got a steal on that because, I know social media is hyping Austin Reeves up and people hate it, but that dude's good. People don't want to admit it. That guy can ball. So that was a good move, being able to re-sign him at a really good price. They did re-sign D'Angelo Russell, which to me, from a basketball perspective, kind of questionable. Because he, in the Denver series, he kind of became unplayable. because he doesn't really play defense very well. And in that Denver series, he was just clanking shots. So I honestly, kind of questioned them bringing D'Angelo Russell back, especially because they also added Gabe Vincent. They lost Dennis Schroeder, lost Lonnie Walker, but they added Gabe Vincent, who, will probably be their starting point guard. And then they added Taurean Prince, who will be part of the rotation. Jackson Hayes. So they added some good, rotation depth pieces. So the D'Angelo Russell re-signing, again, questionable to me from a basketball perspective. But at least from a salary perspective, I do kind of get it. Because one, you'll probably be able to flip him at the deadline. So, someone gets hurt, something isn't working out, you could probably use Russell as a trade piece, because people are going to say, oh, hey, he's been an all-star before, and then want to trade for him. He's not on a max contract or anything, so it's not as hard to trade him. And also, obviously, if you let a guy walk in free agency, you kind of lose that salary that you would otherwise have by re-signing him, even if you don't necessarily want the player, right? It's kind of the whole luxury tax, being able to sign a guy, going over the tax, things like that. So, from a salary team building perspective, I kind of got the Russell move because he is an asset you could use. But when it comes to just basketball fit, not sure. I'm not sure why you would keep him. So, otherwise, I really like what the Lakers did. They're going to be good this year. But I wouldn't be surprised if they end up making additional moves. I have them number 3 in the West in my contender tier. Now for tier 2 in the West, we have these solid playoff teams. Again, these are kind of ones that, they could make the finals if things broke a certain way. And number 4, and I did consider putting these guys lower, but I have learned my lesson and will not underestimate them like I did 2 years ago. Golden State Warriors. A couple years ago when they won their most recent title, I thought they were going to finish 8th or 9th in the West. Ended up winning a title. So I'm not going to make the same mistake. I have them at number 4. I will not bet against Steph Curry. That dude's amazing. He's still in his prime, so they're a surefire playoff team. They're not in a contender tier because of Klay Thompson, Draymond Green aren't quite who they used to be. Obviously Thompson has had all the injuries. Every once in a while he'll turn back the clock and be 5 years ago Klay Thompson. Draymond Green is getting older. And then my other question with them is the Chris Paul move. I totally get moving on from Jordan Poole. That was a great move. Replacing him with age 38 Chris Paul, questionable to me. Will he even fit on that roster? Chris Paul does not really come from an offense and has not flourished in an offense like the Warriors. He is I'm the point guard, I'm going to bring the ball up, we're going to run this play, we're going to run this set, maybe pick and roll, whatever it is. That's Chris Paul. The Warriors are, hey, we're kind of playing positionless basketball in a way. We're running around everywhere. We're shooting threes. We're running fast. The addition of Chris Paul is questionable. And then also the whole starter thing. I don't know if you guys remember, probably 2 months ago or so, not long after the Chris Paul move to the Warriors happened. I think someone asked him, hey, are you good coming off the bench? You have Curry and Klay Thompson, Andrew Wiggins, their starters are already set in Golden State. And he's like, what would make you think I'm a bench player? So there's things like that where I question, Chris Paul's started in the NBA for 16 years, some ridiculous number of years. So I do question the fit with the team and if he's going to be willing to come off the bench. And if he does come off the bench, what does that even look like with their team? And then they lost DiVincenzo, which from a rotation perspective, that sucks. He was good for them. The Knicks got a good rotation piece in him. And then, there's also the if they were to make the finals, they're probably going to need someone like Kuminga or Moody to really develop. Probably Kuminga in particular. That dude is all the talent in the world, but hasn't quite become like a really good NBA player yet. Like I know he plays as part of the rotation for the Warriors, but I think he's still kind of learning how to play basketball. It seems like so I think in order for them to kind of go to the finals and be that contender, they're going to need someone like Kuminga, especially to really develop and take a leap this year. So that is the Warriors at number 4. Number 5, we have the team that lost to the Warriors in the first round last year, the Sacramento Kings. Finished third in the West last year, won 48 games. In terms of roster changes, basically the same. They lost PJ Dozier, Rashawn Holmes. They added Nerlens Noel, Chris Duarte. So, talking fringe moves for sure. But they are still a young team. De'Aaron Fox, awesome. Domantas Sabonis, awesome. He gets a lot of hate. I don't understand it. I think he's the third best center in the NBA. No one seems to really want to accept that, and that's fine, I guess. But the guy's awesome. And then you have Keegan Murray, right? Obviously a much younger guy, but he was good last year, and if he takes another step, like they have a really solid big three that they can go to. So I would expect them to take another step from last year. Maybe not quite as big of a step, but especially with the West being so tough. And here's the other thing with the West: the Western Conference is head and shoulders above the East. So even though some of these teams may not have records as good as some teams in the East, some of these teams will be better than teams in the East despite records. So yeah, like for the Kings, I think they're going to be 5th in the West. With the West being tough, maybe they don't win 48 games again this year. Maybe they win like 45, 47. But I don't think that necessarily will reflect them improving. I think they will improve regardless, even if the record does not reflect that, because the West is going to be a freaking buzzsaw this year. Now we have at number 6. We have, and I might be early on these guys, but I don't care because I love, besides the Magic, even including the Magic, this is the best young team in the NBA. At number 6, this is crazy, I have the Oklahoma City Thunder. They didn't really lose much roster-wise. They added Oladipo and Bertans. But then they also, effectively added Chet Holmgren, who missed his entire rookie year, right? So last year they won 40 games. And if you look at it, the Kings won 48 games, and we're number 3. So essentially it was last year's 8 games separated the 10 seed and the 3 seed. It is not crazy to me to have the Thunder bump that 40 game win total up to 47 to 50. And in that case, they are right there in terms of battling for a top 4 seed in the West. I have them number 6 because they are obviously a very young basketball team. This is, in my opinion, the most exciting young team of basketball. But they have a real shot, I think, at a 4 through 6 seed, even with the West being loaded. SGA is awesome. Josh Giddey is going to be really good. Holmgren, if Summer League is any indication, is going to be great. Jalen Williams was good last year. So, I have the Thunder at 6. This is, again, I might be a year too early on these guys, but they have the talent at least, so I don't sound crazy thinking that they're going to be, a top 6 seed in the West. Those are the solid playoff teams I had. Number 7, we start getting, these are the play-in bound teams. We're at tier 3 now. Dallas Mavericks. So last year they finished 11th in the West. They missed the playoffs. They definitely improved their roster. Okay, so they lost Christian Wood, which is kind of like John Collins. No one really wants him, even though I think he's still a good player. I know Christian Wood is some other stuff, but they lost Christian Wood, which is probably a bit of a downgrade. They lost Reggie Bullock. However, they added Grant Williams, Seth Curry, Dante Exum, and then their rookie Derek Lively, who looks like he probably will play a decent amount. they improve their roster. They're a good team, but they have kind of a weaker front court. And the West is going to be a bloodbath. And then when it comes to the Mavericks, they re-sign Kyrie. They have Luka. I am not necessarily sold on that combo. I have him at 7 just because Luke is amazing, and then Kyrie obviously is an All-NBA type player. They made some good moves in terms of their rotation, and Grant Williams and Seth Curry especially. But I when it comes to the Kyrie Luka thing in particular, they're both amazing individually. But with Kyrie, there's always that risk of him one day waking up and deciding, nah, I don't want to play for Dallas no more. And then it ends up becoming a thing because that's, happened a couple times before, so there's a track record of it. And then when it comes to, their basketball fit, for both of those guys to be at their best, they need to have the ball in their hands. So you have essentially two super ball-dominant point guards, basically, trying to coexist, which is tough. So, we'll see what happens. I have them at number 7 pretty much based on, hey, Luka's awesome, and hey, Kyrie's awesome, and I'm assuming they'll just kind of figure it out, but I do have concerns about them actually figuring it out. It would not surprise me if by the end of the season we're like, oh yeah, that was a disaster. Maybe we should just, actually build a team that makes sense instead of saying, hey, he's a former All-NBA guy. Oh, we already have that position? Bring him anyway. So yeah, Dallas at number 7. At number 8, and don't get mad at me, Memphis fans. Number 8, I have the Memphis Grizzlies. So last year they finished second in the West. They added Derrick Rose and Marcus Smart. They lost Dylan Brooks, Tyus Jones. Talent-wise, this isn't a playing team. This is a solid playoff team, probably bordering on contender status. However, the 25-game suspension for Ja Morant means they're starting the year at a huge disadvantage. The West is going to be too competitive, I think, for them to even make that difference up. So, if Ja isn't suspended, maybe in that first 25 games to start the season, 17-8. Seems reasonable, right? Now, let's say, with the Ja suspension, that 17-8 probably becomes maybe 11-14. Because Ja Morant's awesome. That 6-game swing or whatever it is, I think is enough where they're gonna have a lot of trouble making up that ground in the remaining 58 games of the season or whatever it is. So yeah, talent wise, they're a borderline contender, and they're one of the better teams in the NBA. But that 25-game suspension for Ja, man, that is going to be tough to make up. And while I do like trading, essentially Dylan Brooks and Tyus Jones for Derrick Rose and Marcus Smart, I like Marcus Smart as their kind of starting point guard in the interim and probably move into their backup point guard, obviously when Ja's back. The difference between those two guys is too great between Ja and Marcus Smart for them to, I think, realistically keep the same level of play as if Ja wasn't suspended. And then there's also, some health questions with him, right? Steven Adams is really important to that team, I guess somewhat surprisingly. He was hurt for a good chunk of the end of last year, so they're also going to need to keep healthy, which at this point I kind of have concerns they're going to be able to do that. So yeah, regardless, I mean, if they do make the playoffs, they're going to be dangerous. So this is more of a, hey, regular season, avoiding the plan, probably not realistic, but they're still really good. So, number 8, Memphis Grizzlies. Number 9, I have the Minnesota Timberwolves. So, obviously, last year they finished 8th in the West. They lost to the Nuggets in the first round in 5. There's a lot of people that are like, oh, they probably gave the Nuggets their biggest, challenge or whatever, which, I don't know. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but they still have some really good pieces. I love Anthony Edwards. That dude is awesome at basketball. He, I think, will be in the MVP conversation this year, potentially. That's how awesome I think he is. He will become a superstar this year. And I think there's a decent chance he, at the end of the year, we're like, is Anthony Edwards a top 10 player in the NBA? I think those are realistic questions we might be seeing. Maybe I'm a year ahead, but Anthony Edwards is awesome. Now, I also like Gobert. I like McDaniels. The whole Karl Anthony Towns thing, personally, I think they should move on from him. So there was a big thing over the last week or two or whatever where Bill Simmons floated the idea of essentially a Lillard for Cat swap, which just want to throw that out. Episode 1 of this podcast, I suggested the same thing. To me, this is like the most logical destination for Minnesota or for Damian Lillard would be to go to Minnesota, both from a basketball perspective, which think of a lineup of Lillard, Edwards, and Gobert. That's contender tier probably. And then you think of from Portland's perspective, you're getting Cat back, who's younger than Lillard, fits better with Scoot Henderson, Shaden Sharp, in all likelihood. And you're probably getting someone like Jaden McDaniels back too in that trade. So I have the Timberwolves at number 9. And while I do love Edwards, I think Gobert, while the trade is definitely clowned on, it wasn't the worst thing in the world. It seems that way because they already had Cat. If they didn't have Karl Anthony Towns, that Gobert trade would not be laughed at as much as it is. So, I kind of like some of the pieces they have, and obviously Edwards I think will be a MVP candidate. But with all that said, the West is going to be really difficult to win in. And if they decide to keep the Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns thing going, I don't think that works long term. The 2-center thing doesn't work, man. We've seen a bunch of teams try it. The Nuggets tried it with Jokic and Nurkic. After about half a season of that, they were like, yo, this isn't working. And they traded Nurkic. I think that the 2-center thing just never works. At least I can't think of a situation it did. I guess maybe you could argue the one in San Antonio with Duncan and Robinson, but those were all also two top 20 players all time. And Duncan's more of a power forward anyway. So anytime you're like, oh, hey, I got 2 centers, you have 0 centers. It's like quarterbacks. When you have 2 quarterbacks, you really have 0 quarterbacks. So Minnesota number 9. It's not a talent thing for them. It's a roster makeup and the West being ridiculous this year. Number 10, and the last playing team I got is the New Orleans Pelicans. So they lost Jackson Hayes, Josh Richardson. They added Cody Zeller. So you're talking fringe changes. Finished 9th in the West last year. They lost in the play-in. This is pretty much their team is entirely dependent on Zion being healthy / conditioned. If he's healthy all year, they're a 4-6 seed. Easy. They have that potential. If he misses all year, whether it's an injury or he's out of shape or whatever, they're playing for the lottery at that point. They're missing the playoffs. I like parts of their roster. Like Brandon Ingram's awesome. Love that guy. He's great. He's fun to watch play basketball. Herb Jones, he's really good. Super young. But if Zion isn't healthy, they don't have the top end talent to really compete. Also I like CJ McCollum. Part of that his name is also CJ. So bonus points for me for that. But yeah, roster basically no changes. Them at 10 is basically hedging on, hey, if Zion's healthy, they're a 4-6 seed. If Zion decides, hey, I'm hurt or, I'm not in shape to play basketball, they're like 13 or 14th in the West in all likelihood. So, especially because Brandon Ingram, he is hurt a lot too. Zion's really not the only one, but he's the biggest one in terms of, how important he is to stay healthy on this team. So number 10, the Pelicans. Number 11 is a team I haven't mentioned yet. You're probably like, when's he going to mention this team? I'm going to mention them now. At 11, I have the Los Angeles Clippers. Okay. So they lost Eric Gordon. They added Kenny Martin Jr. They finished 5th in the West last year. They lost the first round to the Suns in 5. You're probably like, hey, this is what are you talking about? This is definitely the biggest surprise of the list. This is probably the biggest zag. But given how good the West is, and given the health issues, the repeated health issues of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, I don't think this is crazy to see them outside of the play-in. This is pretty much the exact same as the Pelicans. Like, if Kawhi and PG are healthy all season, they're a 4 to 5 seed. And, we're getting to the point where if everyone's healthy, there's like 12 fourth seeds, But assuming the Clippers are healthy, they have the talent of a 4 or 5 seed. If either one of them miss significant amount of times, which over the last couple of years is the norm, they might miss the playoffs. Because their roster got worse. They lost Eric Gordon, who was their starting 2 guard. And they added Kenny Martin Jr., who's fine, but he's a rotation piece. They don't really have much in terms of like young talent. It's a super old roster. They have a lot of old veterans. Morris, like they're young. Their young guys are Terrence Mann and Bones Highland, who are they're fine, I guess. Like, I'm not a huge fan of Bones, but like you're not getting far if Paul George and Kawhi Leonard are hurt. Then at that point you're on the Russell Westbrook train, which is an exciting ride to say the least. I would bet if you're a fan of his. So yeah, like the other thing is, as of now, PG and Kawhi, their extensions haven't happened yet. So we're at the end of August right now is when I'm recording this. Kawhi is eligible for an extension right now, and PG is eligible sometime in September. Given their health, it wouldn't surprise me if the Clippers decide, we're not going to give you the max offer that you're looking for. Now, if that happens, and PG and Kawhi are like, I'm not taking anything lower than the max, which, NBA players, it's a pretty common theme, right? It would not surprise me if the Clippers either blow it up and try to, get something back for either of those guys. If they know they're not going to re-sign them, I don't see why the Clippers don't just, hey, we're throwing in the towel, we're starting over. Especially because they could salvage some value where the longer the Clippers wait, the less value they could potentially salvage from either of those guys. And this is especially true if, one of those guys gets mad, they're not getting an extension and decides to hold out or whatever. So I guess we'll see what happens, but the Clippers, I'm very much down on them. I do not think they'll stay healthy because they've proven not to be able to in, 4 years of being together. So I have that at 11. With that said, the trade for Harden's been floated out there. If they do get Harden and they keep, PG, Kawhi, and even Westbrook, I guess that's pretty much a contender, right? Again, assuming health, because it's always the big question with Kawhi Leonard in particular. So at 12, we have the Utah Jazz. Lost some deep rotation pieces, not a big deal. Added John Collins. I like that. I like that move. A lot of people are down on John Collins. I'm not. I think he's fine. He's a serviceable starter. Last year they finished 12th in the West. They missed the playoffs. They're probably going to miss the playoffs again. But I like parts of the roster. Lauri Markkanen, All-Star last year. He's really good. Walker Kessler. They got a great rookie last year, defensive center. That dude's a really good defensive player. And like I said, I like the John Collins move. Issue with them is they don't have like that high-end superstar on their roster, or even a guy that I think potentially could even be that. So they're automatically gonna have a ceiling put on them because they don't have that top end guy. They ended up trading him last year in Donovan Mitchell. So yeah, it's gonna be tough with the West being so good. I think Utah might be in the play-in mix, but what's crazy if Utah's in the East, they're probably in the playoffs, at least in the play-in. So this is probably more of that sucks you guys are in the West this year, because they don't have a terrible team. And last year they just surprised us a bit. They're a little better than we thought. So, at number 12, I have Utah. All right, last couple ones. Number 13, we got the San Antonio Spurs. Lost Base Diop, part of the rotation. They added Jetty, Osman, Reggie Bullock, and Campaign. Pretty good pickups, I think. And then obviously the big one, they added Victor Wembanyama. Last year they were dead last in the West, lost 22 games. The roster obviously got better just because of Wemby. Not to mention the other moves they made, which I think were good. They're not going to be great, but they're super young and they have some really good pieces. Obviously Wemby, but then you also have Sochan, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell. You have a bunch of guys on the team that potentially could be good players. And then Wemby, who, assuming health, is probably a superstar in the making. Just given his just talents and size. It's honestly ridiculous how big that guy is. San Antonio, 13, rebuilding, but, there's some good things to look forward to there. Number 14, I have the Houston Rockets. Lost Kenny Martin Jr., added Jeff Green, Van Vliet, and Dylan Brooks. All of them, at least Van Vliet and probably Dylan Brooks are starters. Jeff Green's probably in the rotation. They finished 14th in the West last year, won 22 games, missed the playoffs. They're definitely rebuilding. But again, they're another super young roster that did the smart thing at this point and brought in good vets to kind of mentor who they got. Van Vliet, been in the league a long time. Jeff Green, obviously, he was drafted back when the Supersonics were a thing. And then Dylan Brooks, who, as annoying as he is, he's a capable NBA player and maybe not the person I would necessarily choose to mentor my young guys, but hey, maybe having Jeff Green there will, kind of help right the ship, I guess. Big Jeff Green fan on this podcast. The Rockets are going to be bad, but they have some good pieces to build around. Sangoon, Jalen Green, Thompson Twin, Kane Whitmore, Jamari Smith Jr. They have a bunch of guys that potentially could be really good NBA players. They have the talent. They're just a couple years away from really knowing what they have. So I expect them to be a pretty bad team this year. But again, if you're a Houston fan, at least there's something to look forward to. All right, so now for the last team in the West, we have at number 15 is the Portland Trail Blazers. So that they lost some depth and rotation pieces, Winslow, Cam Reddish. They added Scoot, who I think is, their franchise cornerstone now. I put Portland at 15 because I'm assuming Dame will either be traded by the time the season starts or he will sit out until he is traded. For me, if Portland, outside of Scoot and Shaden Sharp, those are kind of their two big rebuilding pieces. They're two young guys to build around. It pretty much makes zero sense to me to even play Dame Lillard until there's a trade. Even if Dame played, Portland is not going to be good. They don't have anyone around Dame Lillard who is decent. I guess Jeremy Grant's not bad, but Nurkic is kind of past his prime. Anthony Simons is fine, but he doesn't excite you very much anymore. He's already 25, which is kind of crazy to think about. You still think about him as a young player, but he's well into his NBA career at this point. So if I was Portland, and I think this is what they'll do, you go full tank rebuild mode. You sit Dame if you can't trade him. Otherwise, you trade him, the first good offer you get. And then just kind of, build on Scoot and Shaden Sharp and, hope for the best, I guess, over the next couple of years. So at 15, I got the Portland Trail Blazers. So that is my tiers, I guess, rankings, whatever you want to call them, for the West. Just a quick recap. In the contenders tier, we got the Nuggets, then the Suns, and the Lakers. In the playoff team tiers, tier 2, you got the Warriors, Kings, and Thunder. In the play-in tier, so tier 3, you got the Mavericks, Grizzlies, Timberwolves, and Pelicans. And then the teams that are playing for 2024 and beyond, I have the Clippers, Jazz, Spurs, Rockets, and Trailblazers. All right, that is it for this episode of the Initial NBA Show. Thank you so much for listening. I do genuinely appreciate it. Don't forget to follow, rate, share with your friends the podcasts on all the different platforms, and don't forget about the socials either. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, at Initial NBA Show. I will see you guys next time. Have an awesome week.